Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Kris Mackowski, and joining me is ECW's chief historian and my hetero life mate, Kris White. Kris, how are you today?
I am well. I almost jumped in to say, and I'm Chris White because I'm so used to doing that with Gary Edelman over at the American Battlefield Trust channel.
Uh, well, I thought that we'd get you on today to talk about one of your favorite subjects of all time, and that's Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg. You wrote a great essay for our What Ifs, Great What Ifs of the American Civil War about Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg, and I know it's a near and dear topic to you.
I absolutely love talking about Stonewall Jackson, all things Stonewall Jackson, because you, my friend, know nothing of Stonewall Jackson. You have no love for him at all. Which, if you do not know, Chris Mackowski is the biggest Stonewall Jackson fanboy that there is. And he really, really loves to talk about Tommy. And then I like Jimmy, James Longstreet, as we over the years started calling the two of them when we would start to write. And got to have fun with this at some point. But yes, Chris asked me to write about Stonewall Jackson at Gettysburg. Obviously, he was not there. But it's easy to jump to the conclusion the Confederates would have won if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg. But that is not the case. And I'm looking forward to exploring it with you. But before we get into it, Chris, I just want to pronounce Gettysburg the correct way. I always have to say Gettysburg because that is how you say it. And I get lambasted on videos many times. They're like, no, it's Gettysburg. It's not how it's pronounced. And if you want to see other people pronouncing it correctly, go over to the School of War podcast. And they recently had Scott Hartwig on, who used to be the chief of interp at Gettysburg, and some other folks who also do it. So I have to get that in every time because I know the first comment will be like, Chris Kidd, if you pronounce the name right.
Yeah, yeah. It's I don't know. We had a comment the other day that lauded your encyclopedic knowledge of Gettysburg. So that I think extends to pronunciation.
Well, no, because I'm from Pittsburgh and we mispronounce everything. But this is one of the few things that I do pronounce correctly. So, like, if you go out to Pittsburgh, we have Versailles, which is actually Versailles. We have Charleroi, which is actually Charleroi. So we butcher everything out in Western PA from where I'm from.
Do you now? Okay. Yin's don't know how to pronounce things out there. Is that
That'd be jag off about that.
it? Well, in special commemoration for today's conversation, I have behind us for folks who are watching, actually a picture of Lee's headquarters, and there's Lee there. And of course, we can see Stonewall Jackson right here. He's at Gettysburg, and it's the big muscular Stonewall Jackson because that's the one everybody wants to have there. So obviously, if John Paul Strain painted him, he must have been there. It must be true. So this is a topic that came up for you and I like way, way back in the day when we'd be at Chancellorsville. So tell us a little bit about kind of the origin of why you got interested, or perhaps why how you got plagued by this question.
But yeah, plagued is probably one of the questions. And I'm not the only person who has to answer this. If you're a licensed battlefield guide at Gettysburg, if you have written about Gettysburg, if you speak about Gettysburg, inevitably you have received the question. It would be, either in statement form, if Stonewall Jackson were there, dot, 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 or what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg? Or, of course, there's always if Jackson was there, they would have won. They would have also taken Moscow, and then we would have been perfectly fine, had the longer lasting light bulb, all that fun stuff if Stonewall Jackson would have won Gettysburg. But I think, we really started to see it when we worked at Chancellorsville. As I was an intern there, then a seasonal, and then they hired me on. And it was you know, it was convenient for most Civil War folks to start with Gettysburg. It's the middle of the war. It's the most visited battlefield on American soil, and it's something that piques people's interest. And you get the same questions many times when you work at a visitor center. Where's the bathroom? Where's the driving tour? What time's the movie start? And then it rolls into the more the deeper questions for folks, and you get them at all different levels. But inevitably, at all levels, folks would want to know or state that if Stonewall Jackson were at Gettysburg, would they have won, or they would have won? Is how we go. So I would say that's where it started, and then you and your obsession with this gentleman also had us sitting on back porches, smoking cigars and drinking beers and refighting the war, and me trying to break you of the habit of just Stonewall Jackson's the only commander Stonewall Jackson's the only commander. I love Stonewall Jackson. So, and
I
we're having
do.
fun with this, folks. I know this will annoy a few people, but Kris and I have done this for 20 years now. We've refought the war, and I always have to bust his chops about Stonewall Jackson.
That's right. That's right. I still light a candle to him every time I talk about it. There's one going right here next to me right now. So, and when we were at Chancellorsville, where he gets wounded on May 2nd, 1863, there are a lot of people who, when they would go on those walking tours with us, they'd be like, well, what if he hadn't gotten shot? You know? And then they want to kind of jump from Chancellorsville right to the first day of the Battle of Gettysburg and off to Moscow and longer living light bulbs. So, I mean, it was something that not just at Gettysburg, but we would encounter in Jackson related capacities down in Chancellorsville and even Fredericksburg.
Yeah, and I think it's important that a lot of people's war ends on May 2nd, 1863, or May 10th, the day he dies. Jackson's wounded on the evening of May 2nd. 8 days later, he dies of pneumonia at Guinea Station, which is 27 miles south of Chancellorsville, as he's awaiting to be placed on a train taken to Richmond. He is diagnosed with pneumonia on May 7th and then dies 3 days after that. And I think that when you worked on the Fredericksburg battlefields, and we'll move up into Gettysburg here in a moment, the farther you got away from I-95, the more interested the people usually were. So Fredericksburg is right off of I-95. You'd have to go about 12 miles to get to Chancellorsville, about 17 miles to get to Wilderness, and then you would go farther south to get to Spotsylvania Courthouse. So people would be making that trek out there, and the Stonewall Jackson death site, which used to be called the Stonewall Jackson Shrine, would draw in a lot of people out of curiosity, morbid curiosity, like what is this, to people who know the actual story. And then same with Chancellorsville. So I think that Jackson, especially in that area, was a larger than life figure. When I first moved to Virginia and they had Lee Jackson Day, I was like, get the heck out of here. That's not a real thing. I thought my colleagues were busting my chops, and it was a real thing. So he really was a cottage industry. But Jackson, as I say, and we'll get into, was one guy in a larger war, and he had stopped being an important player on the strategic level once he's pulled in from the Shenandoah Valley and under Lee's wing. That's not to say he's not an important commander on the tactical and operational levels of war, but Jackson is essentially neutered in a way whenever he's brought under Lee's direct command, because he lost that independent command that he once had, and he also is not the ranking general officer in the Army, so he has to play to someone else's tune. I mean, don't get me wrong, he works well with Lee, but Stonewall Jackson, over time, this myth has grown to outshine Lee. And at one point, Robert E. Lee, after the Battle of Chancellorsville, is asked, about Stonewall Jackson's plan at Chancellorsville. And Lee has an ego on him. He has a temper. He has a great sense of humor. And he apparently snapped at this person that, this was my plan. It wasn't Stonewall Jackson's plan, because that myth had started growing up even in the time of the war. It started, that larger than life figure that was Jackson started in the weeks and months after his death. And of course, it's grown into a cottage industry to this day.
Yeah. Walk us through Jackson's wounding real quickly, because I think the questions about Jackson getting to Gettysburg and what happens there really start on the evening of May 2nd. We sort of have to kind of, I think, undermine some of the assumptions people have about Jackson ever getting to Gettysburg in the first place. Tell us about his wounding and kind of that moment in time where all these what ifs kind of start jumping off from.
Well, I'll cut right to the chase, and this is where everyone's going to stop the podcast. And I will say, if you think that Jackson won the Battle of Gettysburg, your paradigm is completely wrong. Um, for Jackson to end up at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, to be staring at Culp's and Cemetery Hill, just like his successor Richard Ewell did in July of 1863, every single thing that happened between May 2nd, 1863 and July 1st had to happen exactly the same way. It's like a bad remake of Back to the Future, or a Star Trek episode where Kirk goes back in time. So you have to set that aside. So if Stonewall Jackson lives, the Confederates don't necessarily win the Battle of Chancellorsville. And Jackson doesn't necessarily even come to Gettysburg. Let's say he's wounded and survives. I mean, he had his arm amputated, he had pneumonia, but this guy can be field ready to come out there. So everything, if you think Gettysburg would happen the way you want it to, because Jackson's there, you have to just pause all belief and say that everything had to happen like dominoes in the same exact order in the same exact way, and it's that's just not how the world works. So I want to put that out there now to play into this paradigm that everyone loves to dissect. We'll play along, and Stonewall Jackson on the evening of May 2nd, he's launched his flank attack, and to put it into perspective, the Confederate Army is going to split numerous times at Chancellorsville. The Confederate Army was spread out along the Rappahannock River in May of 1863, April and May of 1863. And Joseph Hooker, the Union Army commander, will split his army into various wings. His horsemen will go south towards Richmond. Some of them will head out towards the west, and he's going to try to send them into the rear of the Confederates like, quote, an exploding shell, unquote, and to wreak havoc in their rear. That's 10,000 horsemen. Then he's going to send a strong right wing of his army around Lee's left flank, crossing the Rappahannock and Rapidan rivers, to come into the rear of the Confederate lines that are currently held at Fredericksburg. That line of march will carry them through what we know as the wilderness of Spotsylvania and Orange counties, eventually to a Chancellorsville crossroads, which will lead in various directions, just like you'll see at Gettysburg. And there, Joe Hooker will pause. Once he pauses, Robert E. Lee splits his army. He leaves about 12,000 men at Fredericksburg, moves the bulk of his army out to meet Hooker west of Fredericksburg. He smacks Hooker right in the face. And this basically stuns Hooker's army, figuratively speaking. And they will pull back the Union Army around the Chancellorsville Crossroads. That night, May 1st, 1863, Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jeb Stuart, the Confederate cavalry chief, they're going to get together, come up with a plan where they're going to split Lee's army again. And Jackson, with about 29,000 men, will march on a 12-mile circuitous march around the front of the Union Army, ending up on their right flank, while Robert E. Lee, acting as both an army commander and a corps commander, will keep Hooker's attention while Jackson comes swinging in from the right. Lee's army at Chancellorsville has anywhere between 60 and 65,000 men, though I often joke nowadays, I think he had 12 guys and 6 horses because, it's this magical victory. I mean, it's a great victory, don't get me wrong, but man, every time I talk to someone, Lee has fewer and fewer and fewer troops. It's kind of like when you talk about Pickett's charge at Gettysburg. How many guys made the charge now? But when Jackson launches his flank attack, it's about 5:15 in the afternoon. We don't have standardized time yet. His entire corps is not up because it's strung out over miles and miles of marching. It's their first major forced march of the season. The guys don't have their legs under them. So Jackson launches his first 2 divisions of approximately 18-ish thousand men into the Union right flank, which is held by about 800 men facing out to the west. The remainder of them, about 10,000, will be facing to the south, and they catch the Union 11th Corps in the flank. Push them down the road. The 11th Corps doesn't just break and run. There are pockets of resistance, and they put up a good fight for about 45 minutes to an hour. Finally, Jackson will keep pushing forward, and as he does so, darkness is coming across the battlefield in early spring in a place called the Wilderness, where some Union soldiers claimed at the brightest point of the day, you couldn't see the forest floor because the foliage was so thick. Now, in the midst of all of this, Jackson, with a number of horsemen, about 8 horsemen, will ride forward from the Confederate lines as he's deploying his third and final wave, that of A.P. Hill's light division. There's nothing light about it. It's 12,000 men strong. They're deploying as Jackson decides to ride forward in the dark, in the middle of a pitched battle, into the middle of the lines without telling anyone. Stonewall Jackson has deep-seated trust issues that go all the way back to his childhood. People love to dissect him. Was he, did he have some sort of Asperger's? Was he autistic? I can tell you from my perspective, the man has deep-seated trust issues. He's lost a lot of people in his life. He sees the world in black and white. There's no gray area, no pun intended there. And this has really worn on him. So he rides forward. His second in command, A.P. Hill, who is fighting with Jackson internally prior to the Battle of Chancellorsville, was nearly court-martialed prior to the battle, rides ahead to find his boss because he's like, man, if something happens to him, they're all going to blame me. And we have the letter that actually says that. And so AP Hill with 10 horsemen, Jackson with about 9 horsemen all told, ride between the lines, middle of the dark. They hear the Union lines. They hear the Union Army has redeployed. They're chopping down trees. They're digging fortifications. Jackson then turns back and starts riding towards his lines, which are now deployed. And he rides into the front of the 18th North Carolina Infantry. And as the 18th hears these guys coming towards them, they look around. They see a bunch of dead horses from a failed Union charge earlier in the day. And now they have a knot of about 20 horsemen riding towards them, and they start to fire. Jackson's brother-in-law, a guy named Joseph Morrison, screams, "Stop firing! You're firing into your own men." The major of the 18th North Carolina, a guy named John Barry, screams back, "It's a lie, boys, pour it into him." The 18th North Carolina has about 400 men on line. They fire smoothbore muskets. They hit Jackson 3 times, once in the right palm of his hand and twice in his left arm, once in the lower portion, once in the upper portion. That upper portion of his shoulder is going to be hit 3 inches below his shoulder blade, and that's going to completely shatter the bone. Jackson's horse is going to careen off towards the Orange Turnpike, also sometimes called the Orange Plank Road. It's reined in. Jackson's taken, laid down on a blanket, and eventually he will be evacuated from the field in a comedy of errors, getting him off the battlefield. And in the meantime, AP Hill, as he's riding down the Orange Turnpike, not able to locate Jackson, his cavalcade of horsemen are shot. They're either all hit or unhorsed. So because they were on the open versus where Jackson was in this little side road called the Mountain Road, Jackson had a little bit more cover, whereas Hill's men had no cover, and Hill's nearly killed himself. He gets up, gets everyone to stop firing, and now Jackson's knocked out of action. And at this point, Robert E. Lee's has about 14,000 men sitting on the eastern side of a salient, a portion of your line that protrudes outward. On the other side, you have about 26,000 Confederates, and in the middle, you have about 80,000 really angry Yankees. And now Lee has to put Humpty Dumpty back together again.
But of course, if Jackson hadn't gotten shot at that moment, he's able to take all of his men and drive into the Federal Army and conquer them and scatter them off, and then from there march up to Gettysburg. That's how that story's supposed to end, right?
I thought it was supposed to end, but it would have been a bloodbath of epic proportions if they would have launched their attacks. And Kris is setting me up for what Jackson's ultimate orders were. Jackson will send word back to AP Hill, his second in command, before he made this ride out front, and before you all start pointing fingers at John Barry and asking what happened to John Barry, the man who ordered them to fire on these 2 knots of officers. Nothing happened to John Barry. He'll end the war as a brigadier general. Barry made the right choice at the right time. His men were under a threat of an unknown force coming at them in the middle of a pitched battle. He is not going to receive any charges against him. Just Stonewall Jackson, for those of you who like to say he was fragged, meaning he was shot on purpose by his own men, there's no proof or evidence of that. That's all bullocks. So Jackson, at this point, before he rode forward, will send word back to AP Hill, and he will say something along these lines: "Press them, Hill. Cut them off from United States Ford. Press them." And if you know the topography of the Chancellorsville battlefield, and I encourage you to bring up a map of this. West Point Atlas has a great map. I think some of Hal Jesperson's maps might be on Wikipedia, but regardless, the attack path that Jackson was on was a west to east trajectory, following along a road, but with heavy woods on each side. So unit cohesion broke down quickly. Now, what Jackson wants to do at about 8 o'clock at night, is the sun's gone down in a dark forest, is to pivot 12,000 of his men, that is AP Hill's light division, and turn them on a northeasterly direction to attack basically in a diagonal 45-degree angle towards the Rapidan and Rappahannock rivers. They're going to go back towards one of the major line of retreats for the Union Army, and that is United States Ford, or United States Mine Ford, depending on what you want to call it. And Jackson's idea at this point is not to attack east to west, which will bring him back into contact with Robert E. Lee. His idea is now to go on a northeasterly attack pattern up a road called the Bullock Road, which will lead towards the Union rear, he thinks, and will lead them towards United States Ford, which will actually then throw the Confederate line completely off kilter. Because Lee will be pointed in one direction, Jackson will be in another, and then that's going to have to force a whole redeployment of the Confederate Army. What Jackson is not aware of is that off to the left of the Light Division, when he ordered this assault, were the elements, or most of, the Union First Corps, Fifth Corps, Second Corps. In their front, they had elements of Third Corps and 12th Corps, and then to their right rear, they had elements of 3rd and 12th Corps as well. So Jackson was turning the Light Division to go into the guns of about 50,000 Union soldiers. If you ever thought that Cold Harbor was a bloodbath, well, that would be Cold Harbor Take 1 on the Confederate side this time. So going up against George Gordon Meade, the best combat leader in the Union Army at this time, John Fulton Reynolds, he'd be taking on Darius Couch, 2nd Army Corps, taking on part of Dan Sickles' 3rd Corps, and then part of Henry Slocum's 12th Corps. And once you commit to that attack, you're going to go into what we would consider a three-sided box. Once you go into that three-sided box, it is just going to be a pandemonium of that they're charging into. And it's exactly what happens at Pickett's Charge. If you ever study Pickett's Charge, the Confederate front lines shrink the closer they get to the Union lines. From the north end of the Union line swings in Frank Sawyer and the 8th Ohio is along with some New York and Pennsylvania troops. From the south end, here come the Vermonters of George Stannard's brigade, and the Confederates have to go forward right up into Cemetery Ridge, and that goes into a three-sided box. Same exact thing would happen here at Chancellorsville. So Jackson had ordered the death of the Light Division. What saved the Light Division from Stonewall Jackson and utter destruction was, number one, his wounding, Jackson's wounding, and then the wounding of A.P. Hill and the confusion that is going to instill in the Confederate Army over the next few hours.
As part of that comedy of errors you mentioned of Jackson getting evacuated from the battlefield, the artillery barrage that happens at that time wounds Hill, so he can't take the field. We're going to come back to Hill in just a second because I think you have some interesting theories about that. But I've always said that like Jackson getting wounded at Chancellorsville is probably the best thing to happen to Lee because at that moment, everything's been going great. But if you were to carry forward his plan from that moment forward, it would be awful. And for as superhuman as you want to pretend the Light Division is, if you've got 10,000 exhausted men who've been marching 15 miles all day and then thrown them into combat against 50,000 fresh troops, like I just don't ever see how those numbers add up very well for the Confederates.
Well, you also have to take into consideration the numbers on paper that we have are not always the numbers engaged. This is the first campaign of the season. We know that the Light Division has more than 12,000 men in it when it starts off, but we also have a lot of accounts of the straggling that took place at Chancellorsville. I mean, there are units that are way in the back, and guys are like, you know what, I'm tired, I'm broken down. Jackson's sick on the line of march. We have evidence of him vomiting on the side of the road and having a high fever. And so the combat effectiveness of the Light Division, and there's nothing to take away from them. They are one of the finest units in the Confederate Army. It's 9 to 12,000 men, maybe. That would be the numbers. If we took off, let's say we take off 15% for straggling, we'll put them down to let's put them around 10,500 men. But when we also look at the terrain, that's going to dilute you immediately. And then, of course, you're attacking in the night. And the Stonewall Jackson or the A.P. Hill's Light Division had the attrition there was just high over the last few battles, and it's going to be higher at Chancellorsville. So you have combat veterans, but Lee's army, as we know it afterwards, is peaking at Chancellorsville in terms of manpower and what they're able to land killing blows. But I do have to give Jackson credit. After his wounding and after the wounding of A.P. Hill, command devolves to Robert Rhodes. Rhodes is only a brigadier general. It's his first divisional battle, and Rhodes immediately is going to be relieved of command by Jeb Stuart. This isn't a reflection on like Rhodes had a bad battle. It was this guy's in over his head. So Jeb Stuart, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a pitched battle, rides into a wing that he has not commanded since Drainesville in 1861, or a branch that he hasn't commanded since then. and now he is taking over this battlefield. He's going to be like, whoa, whoa, guys, we're done. Let's stop. And then he sends a messenger back to Stonewall Jackson, who's been evacuated to the rear to the Wilderness Tavern. Jackson's operated on, his left arm's amputated 3 inches below the left shoulder blade. And once he's recovering, there's a question from Stewart, like, what should we do? And Jackson, they said for a moment, got the old fire in his eyes and kind of lifted up, and then he kind of sunk back down into the bed. And he says, it's unclear. I cannot tell. Tell General Stewart, to do what he thinks is best. And I think that's an absolutely the right call in the right moment. Jackson has been removed from command. He doesn't know the tactical situation at the front. He's allowing his successor to make that decision. I give Jackson all the credit in the world for not trying to, keep that power chip, as it were, and keeping command and pushing everything forward. Because if he would have, it would have been even worse than what May 3rd was. May 3rd, 17,000 plus casualties around the crossroads, with another almost 3,000 casualties over at Second Fredericksburg and Salem Church.
Yeah. So let's go back to Hill for a second because he gets wounded across both of his calves, so he can't ride his horse, and he turns command over. Um, but I think you've suggested in the past that that may be a more deliberate decision on Hill's part than necessarily like, oh, he's so wounded he can't go in there. It's more like, oh, this is a big crap show I don't want to get involved with. Tell me your thoughts about that.
Yeah, Hill is an interesting character. West Point graduate of the class of 1847. He was supposed to graduate in the famed class of 46, but has to spend another year due to medical issues um, of the personal nature that kept him at West Point for an extra year. And Hill hates Jackson with a passion of 1,000 fiery suns, and Jackson's the same way. And as everybody loves to put Stonewall Jackson up on his pedestal, like, look at him, Julia's shown up, and they're bringing we have Julia, we have Mariana here, we have all these. The last week of Stonewall Jackson's life is so beautiful. All this, well, in reality, when Jackson's in the office, he's trying to take Hill up on every charge that he could. While Jackson's having his loving home life, he's in the office like, I'm gonna get that guy. So I always think the juxtaposition there is always kind of ironic. But Hill and Jackson have never seen eye to eye. Hill's been arrested a few times by Jackson, and at the outset of the Chancellorsville campaign, A.P. Hill decided to pick another fight with Stonewall Jackson. The two of them shared a courier, and Hill told the courier not to tell Jackson anything about what's going on at the front. And this courier kind of gets stuck in the middle. And even though Jackson's the ranking officer, Jackson's like, oh no, that's not going to play. So the two of them are just picking at one another. They hate one another. Um, and so in the winter of 62, 63, Hill writes this eloquent letter to Jeb Stuart. And in it, he is going to say how, and to paraphrase, that I am here to vegetate all this winter under that crazy old Presbyterian fool. And that if he's waiting for the day that Stonewall Jackson messes up, but he said that he will not get any of the blame, Jackson will, but I will get all the blame, Hill will. Because nobody blames Stonewall Jackson for anything. There's a lot of truth to that statement. So Hill not only has a bad attitude, knows that if something goes wrong, he's going to get the blame for it. And then to add insult to injury, he's in this battle. Jackson all of a sudden gets shot by Hill's men, by the way. And now it's like, wow, I'm taking over a true nightmare. My my boss is knocked out of action. He just tried to court martial me. My guy shot him. Oh, I just got grazed by a shell. I'm is kind of how it happens. And I know I'm kind of making light of the situation, but the wound of Hill is supposedly hit on the back of both of his calves by an artillery shell that comes in and grazes him and bruises his calves enough that he can't take to a horse. This is May 2nd. But the day the Battle of Chancellorsville ends, miraculously, A.P. Hill is able to retake command of his division and then by default the Second Army Corps, and he is able to go forward. So My 2 cents is that yes, Hill may have been slightly wounded at Chancellorsville, but this guy seeing the mess that was Chancellorsville, we have to see it in the moment. We can't look at this 160 years later where it's like, man, look at how great that flank attack was. They don't know how it's going to end on the evening of May 2nd. All Hill knows is I got my guys on one side of the Union Army, Lee's on the other side of the Union Army. We are outnumbered, and we are in a position where if the Union Army launches 2 attacks, one towards Hill, one towards Lee, this could all be up for us.
And let's kind of put this in this paradigm that we've been picking at today, because let's say Jackson doesn't get shot, Lee wins the Battle of Chancellorsville. Off we go to Gettysburg, but there is this simmering feud between Jackson and Hill. So Lee reorganizes his army in the wake of Chancellorsville because of Jackson's wounding, and he splits the Second Corps up, moves some First Corps units around, and so we get 3 corps that are led by Longstreet, Ewell, and Hill. But what do we do with this simmering Jackson Hill feud if Jackson's still in the picture?
I think the easiest question, and we don't know because this is just totally a what if, but Lee loves to throw his trash out west. He's done that time and time again. And what I mean by that is rather than deal with an issue head on most of the time, Robert E. Lee, and I know some people disagree with me on this, but the evidence is there. Lee will ship them to the Western Theater. He'll do it after Gettysburg. I mean, Edward O'Neill, Alfred Iverson, both from the same division, they're gone. They're sent west. He's done the same thing with William Tolliver earlier. He's going to do the same thing with John Jones after the Battle of Chancellorsville. If you ever wonder why the Confederate Western Army doesn't perform all that well, Braxton Bragg, that's an easy answer. But the other problem is they're not getting the best and brightest out there at the high command. So the easy answer to your question would be that Hill is transferred west. I think that Lee has to deal with this problem. It's been lingering since Antietam, before Antietam, during the Manassas campaign, second Manassas, I should say. And now that Hill is just as aggressive against Jackson as Jackson is against him, I think the easy answer would be, well, remember in May of 1863, the big problem out west is that we have the Mississippi River that's about to be cut off by Grant and other forces, Union forces. So Hill could be shipped out to the west to do work around Vicksburg or around Port Hudson. Those would probably be the easiest answer. And the question, of course, is also, does Lee even reorganize the army after Chancellorsville?
Right.
That's he says he does it because of Jackson, and he always thought that the corps were too large for one man to wield. Well, they've done pretty darn well with them since they organized them into the wings and then officially into the corps in October and November of 1862. So that might be a cop out from Robert E. Lee, just to say that these guys can't command, Lee or Hill and Ewell can't command that many troops. Or it might be that he does feel that way, that they need to be broken up.
And of course, then that affects how the armies leave Virginia and go up into Pennsylvania. So, do they follow the same routes? Do they get to Gettysburg? And so like here, this paradigm unravels, almost immediately because of that issue. I also want to ask, so Jackson, say he gets shot, um, Lee still wins the Battle of Chancellorsville, but Jackson's got pneumonia. So, I mean, we've got that to figure out with. But I mean, if we think about like, oh, let's say he survives, it could take months and months and months for him to come back. And you alluded to this earlier. If we look at guys like how long did it take Richard Ewell? 9 months to come back. How long does it take Oliver Otis Howard to come back from his amputation? It's what, 10 months? Uh, Winfield Scott Hancock, it takes him, what, 9 months to come back? So, I mean, like, we can't expect Jackson to be back on the horse and in Pennsylvania in 2 months.
Well, I mean, that's the issue. I mean, the monument that you have behind your head, I always call that steroid Stonewall. And that's the idea that people have, is this, Stonewall Jackson looked nothing like that. Neither did Little Sorrel. By that, Jackson's not this ripped Arnold Schwarzenegger who's coming at you to rip you apart. Jackson's human, and I think that that's what we often forget about. Lee is human. We put these guys up on pedestals, but you know, to look at the treatment of Jackson after his wounding. So Jackson's wounded in the right palm of his hand. There was a round ball lodged in the webbing between his first finger and his thumb. So that's how they know that the Confederates fired the volley. The 18th North Carolina is still using smoothbores, and the next closest Union regiment with smoothbores is the 1st Massachusetts Infantry, and they're way too far out of range. Our 3rd Corps unit, they're south of the road. There's no possible way that it would hit Jackson. It would be that Seinfeld episode whenever Keith Hernandez allegedly spit on Kramer and Newman. So in this case, with Jackson, the palm of the hand's okay. It's going to heal pretty quickly. The arm, when it's amputated, Jackson has one of the best doctors in all of America. Hunter Holmes McGuire is one of the founding members of the American Medical Association. After the war, we would consider him a thoracic specialist. To do another TV reference, think about Charles Emerson Winchester III from MASH. She's a thoracic specialist. Is basically your body. The trunk of your body, as they would call it at that time. And even though Jackson's coming down with pneumonia on May the 7th, McGuire's writing about the stump, and he's saying that it's mending. It's something along the lines of the union of the skin is mending nicely. So he's healing. Now, Jackson had lost probably what we estimate half of his blood during the wounding when he's dropped off of the stretcher, and he starts to bleed profusely, and then of course due to the amputation. In fact, he's so weak they have to wait a few hours to amputate the left arm. They don't cut it off right away. So Jackson, after this traumatic wounding with pneumonia, is he able to even catch up by the time the two armies engage in July of 1863? I would say probably no. Now, that does beg the question that you bring up. You have Oliver Otis Howard, Richard Ewell, Isaac Trimble, Phil Kearney in the pre-war years, and others who suffered traumatic injuries. We talk about Richard Ewell changing after he comes back to the Army because he got married to his cousin, Lysinka Brown. I think that historians for too long have just taken the easy route and say, he got married. It's love. That's why he's different. These are traumatic injuries to the body. And it's not just the body physically, it's psychologically. And Winfield Scott Hancock's never the same when he comes back to the Army. Right. That's clear. And his wound when he did arrive for the Overland Campaign had not healed properly. Meade throughout the winter of 63, 64 is writing back to Hancock, get back to the Army as quick as possible. Man, Warren's doing a really good job with your corps, Governor Kimball Warren. And that kind of pushes him too quickly to come back. We'll see this over time where we have these guys. I don't want to call them gun shy because Ewell was definitely not gun shy, but it changes them mentally and it changes them physically. So I think that for too long we've pushed that to the side, especially with Civil War. We start to see that coming out in the First World War. When we start to see combat fatigue really start to be studied, the Second World War especially, and then of course today with the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and the war on terror, we finally start to get those items and start to face the hard truths. These guys aren't just scarred physically. So, with what you're saying, it's anyone's guess if Jackson is back, even if he is wounded and survives the pneumonia.
Now, we're obviously being killjoys, picking all this apart, showing all these reasons why Jackson couldn't ever be at Gettysburg. So I'm sure someone out there is listening and it's like, just put him on the field on July 1st. Get him there. So let me ask you to just parachute him out from some time machine and drop him onto the field on July 1st. Because that's the lost cause porn that everybody wants, is Jackson and Gettysburg on July 1st. What does that look like to you?
So I want to start by saying Richard Ewell is not the worst corps commander at Gettysburg. That is A.P. Hill. Hill's even worse than my nemesis Oliver Otis Howard, and he's even worse than Dan Sickles, who moved an entire corps forward and basically almost cost the Union Army the battle. Hill is the problem, and that is one of the things that I would like to say, like probably why he's going to get shipped west. He's definitely a problem child. Now we of course don't know that. When we get to Gettysburg in July of 1863. And I say this about Ewell because Ewell, throughout the Chancellor or the Gettysburg campaign, the early stages, was compared to Stonewall Jackson at every turn, and he passed every test. They loved the way he marched his men into the valley. They loved the assault at Second Winchester, at Martinsburg, the way they got into Maryland and then finally up into Pennsylvania. His men were all over South Central Pennsylvania. They're threatening Harrisburg. They moved within the purview of the orders of Lee. They also eliminated any resistance that was close by. And they worked very well together. And that all comes down to Richard Ewell being at the head of it. Because at that point, he has 3 divisions, and we have 2 of his 3 divisions under new division commanders. And if you read what everyone's saying, that dude was on the ball. When he showed up at Gettysburg on July 1st, 1863, he marched to the sound of the guns. He attacked. It was full-hearted, the attack that he launched into, but Jackson would have probably done something very similar when they attack at Oak Hill and Oak Ridge. He also brings in his men down the Harrisburg Road under Jubal Early, smashes into the Union flank. I mean, he's hitting all the right beats, so when it comes to what happens after that, and we'll get to that here in a minute, Richard Ewell, according to everybody who used to serve under Stonewall Jackson, was the reincarnation of Stonewall Jackson. Jackson, if you put him into the Gettysburg campaign, and this was my very long-winded way of saying, I think he would have made the same exact decisions if it all played out that Richard Ewell would have. I think that he would have taken Second Winchester. He would have swung through Maryland into Pennsylvania, exploded out like a shell and gone in every direction and threatened Harrisburg. Some people will say, oh, if Stonewall Jackson would have taken Harrisburg, great. Go ahead, take Harrisburg. For what purpose? Get yourself stuck on the wrong side of the Susquehanna River with the Union Army coming at you. So I think that's a larger picture. But on the afternoon of July 1st, 1863, we have Confederate forces coming down the Chambersburg Pike from the west. Those in real time were under A.P. Hill. Like Kris said, if we don't split up the army, those would have been under Stonewall Jackson, because that's elements of the old Stonewall Jackson, or I'm sorry, the light division that came down that road. Then you would add them coming in from the north with Robert Rhodes and Jubal Early. I think the only difference that you would have had was Richard Anderson's division, which was moved over into Third Corps, as well as a few other brigades from Second Corps or First Corps. I'm getting everything all mixed up here. The Pender's division and Hill's division, they would have stayed in Jackson's corps, and then Anderson's division would have went over to Longstreet's corps. So you'd still have about 4 divisions per corps coming into Gettysburg. So Jackson probably would have led the attack or led the assault up there. And then Jackson probably would have come in from the north, come in from the west. I think if Jackson was there, he would have managed the battle a heck of a lot better than Henry Heath and A.P. Hill when they picked the fight. I think he would have known what was to his front. I think he would have not been laying in a sick bed when Robert E. Lee rode up at the Chambersburg or at the Cashtown Inn and said, "What's going on to the front?" And Hill says, "I don't know." I think that Jackson would have had answers. So in that regard, I do think that Stonewall Jackson on the field would have made a few different decisions than A.P. Hill, but I think he would have made most of the same decisions as Richard Ewell, if that made sense.
Yeah, yeah. So I've got a little map here. Let me bring it up because it'll help us kind of understand. I got to see where my map is gone to. Um, it'll help us understand a little bit about the positionings that's going on here because I think that the situation on the ground, if Jackson had been where Ewell is, probably Jackson still continues to make similar sorts of decisions here. So this is a map that our colleague Edward Alexander has put together. And so we've got, as Kris mentioned, Ewell coming in from the north, and we've got Hill coming over here from the west. And it seems to me like things start to unravel for Ewell because as he's coming in, he then gets these calls that stuff's happening out on his far left flank. And gosh, is this a phantom force that's showing up or not? Are there Federals out on the flank or not? Is this a credible threat? Um, and he's got to go investigate and check that out. And I think that's the right thing to do. You don't want to push forward into the enemy's face if you've got a threat off on your left. But why does this become such a controversial thing?
Well, it becomes controversial because he wasn't Stonewall Jackson. Because Stonewall Jackson would have never reconned anything or done this or done that. And I'm being facetious there, but what happens with Richard Ewell? The same thing, if we're playing that game, would have happened to Stonewall Jackson, where the Confederate Army engages with the Union First Corps west of town, and north of town, the 11th Corps. Let's say they push them back through the town itself. Confederates capture Gettysburg, and now you are facing off against East Cemetery and Cemetery Hills and Culp's Hill. And now, as you're sitting there, what Ewell is told is that he needs to attack Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill if practicable. And that's a discretionary order. Jackson is very much about direct orders. You do this, you do that. This is what my expected outcome will be. Whereas Robert E. Lee is much more lax, which is weird because later on in the battle, he's very hands-on with Longstreet's corps, yet he's very lax with Ewell. And that's another topic for another time. But it's not that everything's happening in Pennsylvania, north of the Mason-Dixon line, in a vacuum. The Union High Command is sending troops forward. And you have to remember, the Battle of Gettysburg, as we know it on July 1st, will engage largely elements of Hill and Ewell's Corps. There's a massive traffic jam along Route 30 leading west towards Cashtown and Chambersburg. And that's where the bulk of Longstreet's Corps is going to be stuck. So your second in command and some of your best assault troops are never going to make it to the field on July 1st. There's just no possibility of it. And the third division of Hill or Ewell's Corps has to jump into the unfinished railroad cut just to get to Gettysburg. So you have that. Now let me unpack this in an easier to understand fashion. When the Union Army falls back to Cemetery and Culp's Hill, there's no way for the Confederates to know what's on the other side of those hills. If you ever come to Gettysburg, you can stand on Oak Hill, you can go up onto the tower there, and you can look south, and you can, or Oak Ridge, I should say, and you can look south, and you can see Cemetery Hill, you can see Culp's Hill, you can see the round tops, but you can't see anything behind it. The topography blinds you. So at this point, Ewell, Early, and if Jackson was there, none of them would know what is back there. They've known they've engaged with John Buford. They know they engaged with John Reynolds, and of course, Oliver Otis Howard. Now they've fallen back into the town and onto these heights. What's back there? And at about 4:30 in the afternoon, while Ewell is in the Diamond, which is in downtown Gettysburg, they receive word from Extra Billy Smith, William Smith. He is the governor-elect, 62 years young, or 65 years young, of Virginia. And he's a politician, obviously. And Smith is going to say, like, hey, man, there's some problems out here on our left flank. There are Union soldiers. Well, the Confederate high command there don't believe it because they don't take Smith very seriously. And if you knew anything about Smith, you'd understand why. But what you see on your map here, you see the names Williams, McDougal, and Ruger, and that is the 1st Division of the Union 12th Army Corps. When they arrive on the field, they're going to use an old track from the Revolutionary War era to skirt around a hill called Wolf's Hill, and then start marching across the Benner Farms and towards Benner's Hill, which will take part in the July 2nd battle. Well, as they're doing this, they're deploying into a battle line. They're bringing artillery forward. This catches Smith's attention. And as quickly as they appear, these Union 12th Corps men are pulled back to consolidate the Union lines closer to the area of the Baltimore Pike for the evening of July 1st. And Tom Ruger will write after the battle, it was a timely diversion because he saw Confederate horsemen of the 35th Virginia Battalion of Cavalry. He also saw some of Smith's skirmishers. The Union saw them, the Confederates saw them. But for whatever reason, many people like to ignore the fact that the 12th Corps showed up over there, and that is a legitimate threat to the left flank of the Confederate Army. Now let's add one more layer to this onion, and we have Jeb Stuart, who's nowhere to be found. His horsemen he's taken 3 of the best brigades of the Confederate Army Northern Virginia of horsemen. He's ridden off. He's gotten cut off by the Union Army moving too quickly, but Lee was left with other horsemen, which he's not utilizing well. And so we'll have Albert Jenkins' brigade of Cav here, 1st Maryland Battalion of Confederate Cav, 35th Virginia Battalion of Cav here. So there, we do have Confederate horsemen, but they're not being utilized for the scouting and reconnaissance missions that they normally are. So the Confederate Army is essentially blind. So this little force of the Union 1st Division of the 12th Army Corps gets Smith's attention, which is long enough to get Ewell's attention, which is going to get Early's attention, which is going to get John Brown Gordon's attention, and that is going to draw Confederates off to that area. And even though the Union Army pulls back, it's enough of a threat to give them pause and say, oh crap, something's going on out there.
And this is where I always like to point out, like, let's remember that Jackson was wounded doing reconnaissance. So, like, it's reasonable to think that Ewell is doing the same sort of thing Jackson would have done and conducting some reconnaissance to make sure that his flanks are okay. So again, kind of going back to your earlier point about like Ewell hitting all the right buttons, like I think he's hitting the right buttons here too.
Absolutely. I mean, you cannot commit one of the largest assault forces in the Confederate Army to an assault, and you don't know what's going to appear on your left flank. If the 12th Corps 1st Division sits there, that's a problem. Now, later on, after Ewell makes this decision, the Confederates will capture a Union courier from the 5th Army Corps saying that they are coming down the Hanover Road. So now we have an entire Union, the 5th Corps, marching towards Gettysburg onto the Confederate left flank. So, you can say whatever you want about Ewell, but man, that was a prudent decision at game time. The other problem you have to assess if you're Richard Ewell, and Jackson may or may not have faced this, is on your right flank is A.P. Hill. A.P. Hill had bloodied Henry Heath's division and then bloodied Dorsey Pender's division in an assault on Seminary Ridge, which I call Pickett's Charge number 1 on July 1st of 63. So badly that when Ewell says, look, I'll attack those hills, meaning Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill, but I need support from Hill. And Hill's like, I can't help you. I committed 2 of my 3 divisions. They're bloodied. All I have in reserve is Anderson, which is a bunch of BS, if you ask me, because you don't have just Anderson in reserve. You have the entire 1st Corps marching in behind Anderson. So, I think that was total cop-out on Hill's part. And also on Lee. Lee should have been managing that. So when Ewell is told to look out for his left flank, there are ghosts and ghouls out there, as I like to say, and that's the 12th Corps. But on your right flank, you're not getting any support. So that means I'm going to attack Cemetery Hill, which is now being manned by about 40 Union cannon, the 1st and 11th Corps, which did not route from the field. Now, there were units that routed from the field, but this isn't Chancellorsville. We have evidence of these guys marching through the town, talking to each other, flags are flying, it depends on where you are in the Union lines on how quickly you got out of Dodge. But that brings me to one other point. The town of Gettysburg is the Achilles heel for the Army of Northern Virginia during this battle. If you are going to attack the tip of what becomes the fishhook, you have to attack out of the town of Gettysburg. And there is no good way to do that. The largest and widest street on the south end of town is Baltimore Street. And you could march guys in maybe a company formation like you would see going across at Fredericksburg in December of 1862. Then you have to deploy in front of an enemy that is at close quarters and then try to charge forward. If you try to coordinate assaults, which the Confederates do, on the east side of town near Benner's Hill, you have Gettysburg in the way. If you try to coordinate over on Seminary Ridge, where Pender is, you have Gettysburg in the way. And this will play in on July 2nd and 3rd whenever they are trying to attack Culp's Hill and Cemetery Hill. The town of Gettysburg offers absolutely no strategic advantage to the Confederates. Yes, they are blocking the road towards Harrisburg, the Union the capital of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. But that's not one of the operational goals of the Union Army during this campaign. Their goals are to protect Baltimore and Washington. They are down along the Baltimore Pike, a road that they command. And to add, insult to injury, you have to locate the Confederates, who are now sitting here and staying, and now you have to defeat them. So the Confederates holding the town of Gettysburg is actually going to make it easier for the Union Army to win this battle. I know that sounds counterintuitive. Plus, the town of Gettysburg is not filled with the supplies you would think, because the people of Gettysburg in late June have evacuated as much as they could because they knew the Confederates were coming. And then the Confederates came in force on June 26th and took whatever they could. So you're now stuck with a town that is full of civilians, it's full of wounded, narrow streets, and it is going to hinder the deployment of the Confederate Second Army Corps.
And then we get to that idea of if practicable, because now Ewell's got to consider all these things that you've just mentioned, the potential threat on his left, the lack of supply on his right. He's sitting in a position that's really hard to occupy and doesn't do him any good. We've got Federals that are now forming on the hills below. And this phrase, if practicable, which I think haunts this story, and has for more than 160 years, because it doesn't show up in writing until Lee writes his report of this battle in January of 64. So we
Well,
don't
that's
even
his
know that.
second report. So he
Yeah.
writes his first report on July 4th, and then his second report comes out in January 64. Sorry, go ahead.
No. But we don't know that he actually even uses the phrase specifically, unless the couriers used it, but did Lee use it? And what does it mean? And is it discretionary? And I know some people like to criticize Ewell saying, well, a discretionary order from Lee is an actual order. But that's not the way Ewell's used to working with Stonewall Jackson. So, unpack this phrase for me and how problematic it becomes.
First and foremost, Ewell will say, "Can't the?" And I'm going to paraphrase, "Can't the old man give a direct order?" That's going to be something he complains about Robert E. Lee as a commander. You bring up a salient point talking about Ewell, Jackson, and that command culture. You have to remember that there is a culture within every Union and Confederate armies. This carries over to our modern army. They will take on the personality many times of who is commanding it. The Army of the Potomac, up until June, July of 1863, was a cautious force that had every stunk of every inch of George McClellan. We finally start getting the McClellanism out of the Army once Hooker kind of comes in, and then, of course, Meade finishes it off. Braxton Bragg, the Army of Tennessee, all the high command knows how to do is quarrel with each other because Braxton Bragg quarrels with everyone else. Robert E. Lee, he gives his men the opportunity to take risks. They're calculated risks. He wants them to take those, but he encourages that time and again. That's a great feature in a commander. But Stonewall Jackson was the opposite. Stonewall Jackson wanted you to do what Stonewall Jackson wanted you to do. And you follow the orders to the T. And if you did not, you are up for a court martial. I mean, what was it? 20 plus people this guy brought up on charges during the war. He was terrible prior to the war about doing this stuff. That's what ended his career with the old army. He gets into a big fight with Blinky French, Absalom Baird, and others down in Florida. That's why he has to leave the old army. He was tough to deal with. And that is what he carried over to his Valley Army. And that is what Ewell was used to. Because remember, Ewell was wounded in August of 1862. He served under Jackson then, basically as an independent commander, and then as a wing, whenever Jackson was a wing commander. And now when he comes back, when Ewell comes back, he is an officer who is used to being told what to do. And when Lee is making suggestions rather than actually issuing orders, and that fault lies with Lee, it does not fall with Richard Ewell. You can't read your commander's minds. Ewell is stunned like a duck hit on the head, to steal a term from Abraham Lincoln. He doesn't know what to do. And I think he also has some big personalities serving underneath him, especially with Jubal Early. Also, a guy named Isaac Trimble, who actually doesn't have any command in the Army of Northern Virginia, who attached himself to the Army, tried to give Lee a bunch of advice during the campaign. He's like, why don't you go hang out with Ewell? And so he's got, Rhodes, who's kind of sick and impotent during this battle. Early and Trimble have these big personalities, and then Ed Johnson, who's coming back for the first battle as a division commander ever, and who, by the way, also had served directly under Stonewall Jackson in the Valley and is used to direct orders. So what you have are two cultures clashing with one another within the Confederate Army. You have Jackson's stringent command structure that is so turgid that you can't go outside of it. And then you have Lee, who's more loosey goosey and who encourages his men to think and take those calculated risks. And the two of them came to cross purposes here on July 1st. And it comes to a perfect example of why Jackson should never be in charge of an army, because not only is he going to court martial everybody, and we've seen that time and again, he also is going to run it with an iron fist whenever it comes to how he wants you to operate. He's not going to want you to think outside the box. I mean, hell, Jubal Early made the right call at Fredericksburg and still thought he was going to get court-martialed.
And I think that's probably the first button that Ewell doesn't hit that's a Jackson thing, because he does turn to Early and says, go take that hill, and Early, and I think Jackson would have been, you're under arrest. And then he would turn to Gordon and say, you go take that hill. Ewell doesn't do that. He ends up having some problems with his commanders about who's going to go take that hill and why. Walk us through that, because I think those big personalities you mentioned, that's what's going to cause this problem for Ewell and the hill he doesn't take.
Well, Robert Rhodes arrives first on the battlefield with his division for the Second Army Corps with Ewell in tow. They arrive on Oak Hill. They were going to attack a place called Oak Ridge. It's not reconnoitered properly by Rhodes. Ewell is doing exactly what Jackson would do. He's saying, go take that position, and he's leaving it to Rhodes to make the dispositions to do so. Rhodes makes terrible dispositions and bounces off of the Union lines. The famous Iverson pits, the burials of at least 79 Confederates in one straight line at Gettysburg are out in that field. Edward O'Neill's brigade bounces off. It's poorly handled. And within about 2 hours, Rhodes, the largest division at Gettysburg, numerically speaking, 8,500 odd men, have lost between 2,000 and 2,200 men in these ill-fated assaults. Early comes down the Harrisburg Road, finds roughly the Union right flank, hits it, and there's resistance, but it ain't like it was at Chancellorsville, where you have the Bushbeck line and you have Dilger standing and fighting. There are Shezhenovsky's brigade and some others are going to put up resistance, but like Early's men they had not taken the substantial casualties as Rhodes. So when they arrive in Gettysburg, Early, Rhodes, Isaac Trimble, and Richard Ewell will be in the center of town, and they're going to get this order from Lee. And now it turns into a debate. And I do think you're right, Kris. This is where it all goes off the rails for Ewell. This would have been the Jackson moment of saying, shut up and do your job. And they start to kind of ponder what to do. And Rhodes is like, hey, man, my guys are played out because of these assaults. Early says the same thing. It's like, are you kidding me? You still have Smith's brigade in reserve, who you didn't let go forward. Avery and Hayes's men were engaged along Stevens Run, where you see the name Early there. That was with Coster's 3 regiments of Coster's brigade. And Gordon's men took on Barlow's division, and so they're probably roughly handled. But these guys are not, by any stretch of the imagination, Avery and Hayes's brigade there with Smith's fought out like Rhodes. So Early begs off and says, why don't you let Johnson do some of the fighting, because we've done all the hard fighting, which really upsets Johnson. Johnson had been sent with all of the supply wagons that they had captured, all the booty from South Central Pennsylvania, down along the Black Gap Road, back through a place called Scotland, Pennsylvania, where they're going to start coming back in on the Chambersburg Pike, closer to Chambersburg. Then the battle starts, and now Johnson has to jump into the railroad cutout near a place called Seven Stars, about 5 miles to the west of town, and use that to get into town. In the meantime, Johnson's guys aren't in the field. Early's throwing shade at him, Civil War era style. And now, by the time Johnson gets into town, his men are going to have to march through Gettysburg, and as I pointed out, which is an Achilles heel, then get into a battle line and go towards Culpston Cemetery Hill. And by that time, it's becoming dusk. And in that time, nothing's happening in a vacuum. The Union Army, by the way, had something to do with the loss at Gettysburg for the Confederates. We have the 3rd Army Corps arriving on the field, the 12th Army Corps, Oh, by the way, Winfield Scott Hancock at his finest hour arrives to take over operational control of the field. You have two of the best artillery commanders in the Union Army, Tom Osborne of the 11th Corps, Charles Wainwright of the 1st Corps, redeploying troops and redeploying their guns on Cemetery Hill, Stevens Knoll, and Culp's Hill eventually, not all at once. So the Union Army is prepping for problems, and Meade's sending more troops in this direction. Yeah, so that's what Ewell's facing. Eventually, the Confederates will send a scouting party towards dusk up towards Culp's Hill in the 42nd Virginia. They'll be captured. The bulk of them will be captured by elements of the 7th Indiana, commanded by Ira Grover, who, against orders, arrived on the battlefield at Gettysburg, and for his heroism is court-martialed. And then, that's like it stops. And this is again where Ewell kind of drops the ball. When Lee shows up later that night, he's like, "Hey, did you guys take that hill?" They're like, "Nah." And Johnson's like, "Oh yeah, I forgot to say I didn't take that hill." Like, it's like, "Oh crap." You look like an idiot in front of the boss. And that's whenever the larger conversations take place for another time. And if you listen to our other podcast we did a few weeks ago, you could hear that, talking about, should we leave the Second Corps out on this side of the field? Should we consolidate them on the west side of the field? What should we do? So that's kind of where we are with Ewell.
And so, kind of bringing this then back to Jackson, it seems like, if people want to parachute Jackson in here on this first day, we're probably not going to see a whole lot different right up until that final decision by Early to be like, no, I can't go do this.
Well,
So
and I think the larger question to answer is, okay, Confederates win the Battle of Gettysburg on July 1st. Everyone at this point immediately is like, yep, that's it, war's over. Why? The U.S. Capitol has fallen 3 times in our history. It fell during the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, and on January 6th. We're still here. Okay. So that's the old 19th century way, 18th century way of looking at warfare. If the First Corps and the 11th Corps were defeated at Gettysburg, there are 5 more corps in the Army of the Potomac, not including 2/3 more of the horsemen under Meade's command. Plus, there's the Middle District and Middle Division that is basically the Baltimore, Washington area that still has troops. There is, and they're not great troops, there's the Department of the Susquehanna, north of Robert E. Lee. So if you win the Battle of Gettysburg, what do you win? Plus, let's add to this, again, things are not happening in a vacuum. George Gordon Meade has sent out the Pipe Creek Circular. The Pipe Creek Circular, for those of you who don't know, is a contingency plan. If we make contact with the enemy and we need a fallback position, we're going to go to Little Pipe Creek just across the Mason-Dixon line in northern Maryland. And he laid out in meticulous detail where the First Corps, the Second Corps, all the corps would be laid out. He has a backup plan. Lee's rolling the iron dice of war and seeing what comes up next. So if you win the Battle of Gettysburg, what battle did you win? It is the penultimate battle in this campaign. We wouldn't even call this the Gettysburg campaign. In fact, we would probably call this the Pipe Creek campaign or the Emmitsburg campaign or something else, because the battle is going to take place closer to Taneytown and Emmitsburg, because Lee's ultimate goal is not to attack Washington. It's the most heavily fortified city in the world at this point. If he takes Baltimore, that's great. Philadelphia, Harrisburg, they're too far out of his area of operations. So the real goal is to destroy the Army of the Potomac. And now you have bled out 2/3 of the Third Army Corps, which would have been Second Corps if we have Jackson there. And you've now have the enemy on ground of their own choosing, as we hear from the movie Gettysburg, in a heavily defensive position, a fortified position, just like Lee will have at Falling Waters a few weeks after the battle. So, you can say, okay, Jackson won the battle. Great, I'll give you that. What battle did he win? You defeated 2 Army Corps. You got the rest of the Army of the Potomac, the Department of Susquehanna, and then the Middle Department to deal with. Good luck, buddy.
So as we get ready to wrap up, let me ask you, why is it so many people want to put Jackson in Gettysburg?
Well, like you said, and I didn't say something like this for once. This is the provocateur in Kris Mackowski. It is lost cause porn. They think that at this point the Confederacy can still win the war, and they think that this is the only thing that's standing between them and victory. Well, there's these places out in Mississippi that are about in Louisiana that are about to fall. We've got a major Union army that's about to move through Middle Tennessee down into Northwest Georgia. They're seeing it in a vacuum. That's why I say, what battle do you win at Gettysburg? I think that's part of it. I think another part of it is people love the underdog, love to for good or bad, they love the underdog story. And the Confederate Army, at this point, it is an underdog story. And then it's just, really the myth of the lost cause is not, it hasn't died. And by the way, it's not a modern historians who came up with the myth of the lost cause. Edward Pollard dubbed it the lost cause shortly after the war, and it's a massive tome called the Lost Cause. And whenever you get into the 1890s and early 1900s, this is taught in schools. You can see where the UDC, United Daughters Confederacy, actually have checklists of what you're allowed and not allowed to teach. Boy, that sounds familiar nowadays.
Mm.
In schools. And I have those. What did I call those? Scary links when I send them over to you. When I uncovered them years ago, and it tells you can't talk ill of Robert E. Lee. You cannot say that President Abraham Lincoln was a good person. You cannot disparage the Confederacy. You can't do this. You can't do that. And those people who are going to push back and say, "Oh no, this, that, and the other thing," this has been ingrained in generations of Americans, North and South. This isn't just in the South. I think that's the great misnomer. One of my favorite stories of leading a tour at Fredericksburg was this family that showed up, and I'm not exaggerating. They had Confederate hats, Confederate flag hats, Confederate flag shirts, belt buckles, boots, and I was like, "Where are you from?" They're like, "Albany, New York." I was like, "Did you move there from the South?" "Nope, that's where we're born and raised." So it goes in both sides. And I also think when it comes to warfare, people love the Monday morning quarterback, and they love to play what if games. I mean, there's a whole cottage industry that is ESPN, Fox Sports, all of them that, man, Tuesday comes during NFL season, man, I tell you what, Mike Tomlin should have been fired last week. Well, I should have been fired 5 years ago, but that's my argument. And and then this guy did this week and that, and I think that's the mentality that we live in today. And they did it at the time too. This happened in real time. Don't think that we're the only ones Monday morning quarterbacking. Within 48 hours of this loss, it's hitting the newspapers throughout the South that Robert E. Lee screwed up and playing Monday morning quarterback. But I do think that's a big thing. People love to question those items, and they have fun with it. As a historian, it drives me absolutely up a wall, because I often say, like, you don't need a lot of these Hollywood movies, because what has happened in history, man, you don't need to write fiction when you have the fact. So when you ask me to write this piece for the What Ifs book, one of my goals was to use as much of the historical text, especially primary sources, that I could, and put you in real time and in the boots and shoes of these men, both North and South. So I think there's a lot to do with that. And then finally, I'll say the Eastern theater of the Civil War to this day outshines the Western theater. It is closer to the population centers. It has the sexier, if you were, Confederate leaders. Of course, after the war, everyone's tearing down Grant and Sherman and everyone else. So it's that area where people love to focus on. The Confederates, by this point, they don't, they're not going to win. And I think that it drives me nuts that how overestimated the Confederate cause was, or still is, and their desire, their devotion, all this. Flip the coin. The Northern people were the same way. Abraham Lincoln, you picked the fight with the wrong guy. That dude was not about to back down. You had a Northern people who were sick of the slave power theory prior to the war. They were sick of being bullied in Congress and in the Senate. We wanted the Transcontinental Railroad. Let's fight over that, because we'll have North versus South, Democrats split in two. I mean, this goes all the way back to the antebellum period. And I think at this point, people just really, really, really want to focus on the narrow, and they want these things to happen because it didn't. It's never made sense to me. I like the United States. So the Confederates winning, I think the whole Western world would look a lot different if they had won.
Yeah, for sure. Well, that's a conversation for another story, another time for sure. So, Kris,
Yeah, I'll
wonderful
get
to have
off
you.
my soapbox.
Yeah. Wonderful to have you back with us, man. I really appreciate the chance to chat with you today. So,
Chad, it's me. I have holding a diatribe for this one. I think the next time we need to actually have a conversation. I thought you'd be more in on it, but man, you were setting me up to hit all the
that's right.
beats
I'm
that
just pitching
I
you
normally
softballs and letting you go, man. On behalf of Chris White, I'm Chris Mackowski. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.